Welcome back to the show. Today we have Mike Lingle. He's an entrepreneur. Well, I think you're a little bit more than that, to be 100% honest with you. You've been extremely successful throughout your career, and you kind of run your own thing. But I kind of wanted to have you back on the show because you've been writing some really good articles. You've kind of been in the trenches. You've founded a company. You've sold a company. You've worked for huge companies. You've kind of done it all. You've done some mentoring. So, Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks. It's good to be back here. Thank you for reading the articles. I'm glad you're getting something good out of them.
Yeah, I actually really love the blog posts and the articles that you've been kind of putting online. I think they've been really useful, and anybody that kind of follows me on social media, I've been trying to share them out because they're great. Like, I'm even finding tons of value in them, right? And so I try to actually read and post the stuff that I find valuable. I know some people, there's kind of been some stuff online recently where people are just like sharing articles. They just read the title, but like I've actually read your posts and I've actually shared them because I enjoy them. So
that's good to hear.
Yes.
I don't want just another title.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe kind of before we get into kind of what you're working on now, maybe let's cover your background quick and get to know you a little bit better. So maybe we start off with where you grew up.
Sure. Okay. I mostly grew up in Ohio and New Jersey.
Okay.
But actually, my parents met in the Peace Corps, and I was born in Caracas because they were living in Venezuela. And we're actually planning a trip to Chile in November because my dad has his 50th year reunion of his Peace Corps trip coming up. So we're going to Chile for the first time.
That's awesome.
For a week, which is going to be awesome.
Sure. I had a friend that's from Chile, and like I've never been, but it sounds like an amazing country.
They've apparently got a really good, they've got a tech scene down there. I've talked to a couple people who've been through an accelerator in Santiago.
Oh, very cool.
That people speak highly of, so I may check that out while I'm down there. I'm not sure.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. How long are you guys going for?
We're going to be there basically a week.
Okay. That's cool. Very cool. So how did you, maybe let's kind of cover, where did you end up kind of going to school, and then how did you end up starting your company?
Okay, so my dad was a computer geek, and this was back in the 70s, but I can remember as a kid, he was at Ohio State University, and he was studying statistics and psychology, so kind of the measurable science of psychology, and he was working on the mainframes with those big punch cards, you know? Yeah. So I remember that from being a kid, and then we always had computers in the house, so even before Apple came out with the Apple II, we had this TRS-80 computer, and my dad was always programming, and he just kind of got me into programming from a very early age.
Sure.
And so I did that all through high school, and then put it down for a while. And then coming out of college, I wanted to be an architect, and so I was working as an architect. I went to school in Philadelphia and started working for an architect in Philly. And really got into the 3D rendering stuff. So kind of got back into computers through the graphics. And it was right at that moment when like Jurassic Park was coming out and Terminator 2 came out, and there were all these like crazy special effects. And like you could do some pretty cool stuff just on a Mac.
Sure.
And so I really got into that. And then one of my friends turned me on to a development environment called Director, which was kind of like
I remember those days.
Right, it was like the predecessor to Flash. So you could sit there and make graphics and make these really cool programs. And so I ended up, I kind of hit a dead end in architecture. Like I wasn't going to get to do cool stuff, and I wasn't really going to get to make any money for years and years and years.
Sure.
And if it had been one or the other, if I was getting to do cool stuff and not getting paid, or if I was getting paid and not doing as cool stuff, either one of those would have been fine. But the combination of not getting to do cool stuff and not getting paid was tough. But then with the development stuff, once I really got into the director thing, it was kind of like architecture, but I could do it right away.
Sure.
Like there was the engineering piece because you had to build the structure, but then there was also the design piece because whatever you were building had to be used by human beings, so it had to serve a purpose. And it kind of checked the same box as architecture did for me, but I could just show up and do it. You know, I didn't need to apprentice. I could just talk my way into it, you know?
Right. That makes sense.
So I really came at the tech thing as a developer. So I got my first, I got hired by Columbia University to build a, like I was an employee on a grant for one of their research labs, and I was building educational software for kids to learn about earth science.
Right.
And the first module was on earthquakes and seismology. So I was working with the seismologists at Columbia and a bunch of teachers. We had like this panel of teachers and a bunch of students. And it was my job to sort of take all this information from the scientists, package it into something that worked, that the teachers agreed to, and then put it in the classrooms and see if the kids are actually learning, and then kind of go back and repeat. So it was a lot of sort of thinking through the design problem and then, you know, testing it in front of real human beings, taking the feedback and iterating the product.
Sure. No, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's great. And you learn a lot. Like putting something into a real human being's hands, you really learn a lot. Like I've been doing a bunch of user testing to help a client out in the past couple weeks. Okay. And you know, you're building this thing, you've got this idea in your head of how people are going to use it, and then you sit human beings down in front of it, and they do something completely different than what you think they're going to do.
Yep. I know, like, I always joked before that any day that you think you're, like, the greatest designer or developer on the planet and you need an ego check, go do some user testing.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Because that'll knock your ego back in check so fast. It's hilarious.
Yeah. And like with this thing yesterday, like this, you know, this company built all these great features, and people can only find like half of them. They don't even, like in half an hour of sitting with the software, they still haven't found half of the features that, you know, these people put all this time into.
Sure.
And the button's right there. It just doesn't, you know, it's not pulling the user in the way it's supposed to.
Sure. So I'm curious then about how do you, maybe let's back up a little bit, and how do you kind of start with user testing? Like how do you're working with this company on their improving their user testing. So like how do you even kind of start doing that kind of stuff?
Okay, so for me, and I'll just go back and say I really got into tech through the development. Okay. And then I was getting enough projects that I started putting together a team, so I kind of backed my way into management.
Sure.
And I made a lot of mistakes along the way. And eventually I switched out of being the developer and more into a management role, and then sales and marketing really became my thing. So it's funny, I was joking the other day, I realized, and I hadn't really thought about this, I have been a technical co-founder and I have been a non-technical co-founder.
Interesting.
So I've tried both combinations. So it's crazy. Like, I mean, you know, I'm 45 years old, so I just have a lot of experience and I've tried a lot of different things.
Sure. It's good.
But I learned a lot from being the developer, and I learned a lot from not being the developer, right? And I think really the user testing starts before the product is even built. And one of the mistakes I made as the non-technical founder was waiting around for the development guy to build the software.
Sure.
When really, you know, and part of that was I already kind of knew the market and I kind of knew the customer. But really, there's a lot of work to be done before anything gets built. First of all, you have to really understand the problem. So there were user interviews that can happen before you have a minimum viable product, before you even have a mock-up. You know, I've been working with another client with another CEO where I have her out interviewing, and I think she's done like 20 or 25 interviews with her customer base. And we've come up with, you know, a set of problems, and they really talk through, are these problems, how would they rank these problems, how are they dealing with these problems, are they paying any money to deal with these problems? And you really get a sense of like what the pain points are, what people are willing to solve versus live with, what the competitive landscape looks like before you even design anything, right?
Totally. I think that's actually really good advice.
Yeah, because then you understand, it gets out of your head and you're getting those reality checks that you and I were talking about before you've built anything, because it gets really expensive once you've built something.
Totally.
But it's free when you're just talking about it, right?
Yep, totally.
So then I think there's a second layer, which is, okay, now we understand the problem. Let's mock something up. And I think it really needs to be mocked up in a way that looks convincing. Like you can't necessarily walk into an average person's, you can't walk up to an average person and show them like a napkin sketch and expect them to use their imagination. You and I can do it, but my mom can't, you know?
Totally. Yeah, like I
That's to
know
my
for me, I really like the clickable prototype.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And to be honest, nowadays there's like so much really good software that you can basically build a clickable prototype pretty inexpensively.
Right.
I really like Webflow. I don't know if you're familiar with that
I
online
use no
tool.
flow.
It's basically like a browser based. You kind of need to understand how to code kind of and design, but you don't
Okay.
actually write code, but it's
Right.
almost like you can like drag and drop like CSS elements and kind of theme, and you can build your whole clickable prototype, and it generates the HTML. I'm not saying you need to use the HTML that it generates, but you can get like a clickable prototype that you can actually take to people and say like, here's it on a desktop, and here's it on a phone, and here's on a tablet, right? And then you can fake enough screens that eventually, and then you can tweak it and change it, and then you can eventually say, well, okay, now we have a product. Let's go get this thing actually like built and connected to a
Right.
database and put in your back-end code or whatever you're doing. So I found that really useful. The other tool that I found is the Adobe Experience Designer. It's part of the Creative Suite,
Okay.
and it's kind of like Sketch meets Illustrator meets Photoshop a little bit. It's kind of
Mhm.
vector, but the nice thing about it is, especially if you're doing mobile stuff, you can make all your like static screens. You can make like buttons clickable and go to another screen, and you can kind of
Oh,
fake
that's
the
great.
whole thing. It's really, really good. Those are two tools I use personally
Right.
for
And
some
that
stuff.
moment where you take that and put that in front of people,
Yeah,
again, 20 to 25 sessions where you're sitting with different people and really watching them interact with it, you learn so quickly, the things that I assume people are going to do and understand and value are very different than what actual people do.
totally, totally. And they don't care whether the data is hard coded or actually coming from a database. They
They
don't
don't.
know. They never will know, right? And so if you can build these things super early on, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Right. So in one of these projects, I'm coming into a piece of software that's already shipping.
Okay.
So we're already further down the path.
Right.
Versus this other CEO I'm working with, this woman, we really have a wider scope of ability to redesign stuff.
Got you.
Version 2 is going to be completely different than the version 1. So it's nice to go through the whole process. And there's a book called Running Lean by Ash Maurya that I love, but he adds a really smart second part to that mock-up stage, which is because you learned about the competitive landscape and the what people are paying in the original problem interviews, you can go in with the pricing model in addition to the mock-ups and get people and try to get people to commit to pay.
Sure.
Like, because you can't really test pricing by asking people. You can only test pricing by getting people to pay.
Totally.
But you try to get them to pre-commit. Like, if I come back to you with a real working thing of like, show me how you would interact with this. This is the price I'm going to charge. Can I come back to you in a month and run your credit card and, give you this? Again, you learn a lot very quickly. But it's got to be based on the real problems and your real understanding of the customer that you developed in that first round of interviews.
No, I think that's really good advice, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you're right. If you can have basically paying customers the day you launch, that's ideal.
Right.
And a lot of people, I think, are scared to do that, though, right?
Yes, because, people want to be perfect. And so in this model, you haven't even built a minimum viable product. Everyone's always talking about their MVP, their minimum viable product. In this model, you still haven't built the minimum viable product, but you have pre-committed paying customers to the features that you're going to put into that MVP, and then you go build the MVP.
Yeah.
And I think with a lot of entrepreneurs that I talk to, they're in this kind of indefinite, expensive MVP stage, because everyone's read the Lean Startup and they're like, I need my MVP. But the MVP is complicated, and by the time you build it, if that's your first time you're putting things in front of people, you have a very expensive, time-consuming process of unwinding some of the stuff that you didn't realize wasn't going to work. Plus, you have selection bias because you've put all this work into it, so you want your thing to win. You're just going to assume that they're stupid.
Yep, that's fair. And the other thing, and I'm curious to know if you found this as well, is I found like even clients that are paying love if you basically say, look, I'm looking to kind of add some features, or I know it's not kind of feature complete yet, but I would love to get your input so, we can make the product better. And I've found so many clients really love to be part of the development of a product that they're paying for. Have you found that as well?
Yes. Yeah, and I think, and that's what I'm doing with this other company with the shipping product, is going back to customers. So I'm doing two things. I'm going to customers who are already using it, and then I'm also introducing some people to it for the first time.
Got you.
So I sat with one of those first timers yesterday, and watched them go through the process of figuring out how to use the software.
Got you.
Versus going and hitting people up who've been using it for a few months now and who are customers. And I learned something different from each side of the table. But yeah, it all sort of feeds into what is it that people really want. And again, you just learn so much sitting with an actual human being. And even if you have great analytics, there's a couple tools you can use now. You have great analytics, and then you have these screen recordings where you can essentially record someone's session with your product, or 1,000 people's sessions with your product. And you learn a lot from that, but there's still some guessing.
Sure.
Because the analytics and the recordings show you what, but they don't tell you why. They don't really let you into the person's head. Versus if I'm sitting with someone, I can have them walk me through what they're thinking, and then I can ask follow-up questions about, like, why did you do this? Or, what does this seem like it means to you? And it kind of gives me a shortcut to get to an answer versus having to guess after I've seen the analytics.
No, I think that's really good advice. The one thing, though, I'm curious, and I have my kind of thoughts on this, is when you're doing the actual testing with a user and you're sitting next to them, do you tell them, or what do you tell them your involvement is with the product? Because in my experience, I've found it better to say, oh, I didn't do the design, I don't do any of the development. Even if you did, you basically, and I get that, like, I'm not saying you should lie, but I found I got better advice saying, look, I'm an objective third party, I didn't do the design, I didn't do any of the development, so you're not gonna hurt my feelings. Because I find if you say, like, oh, I did the design on this, people try not to give you design feedback because they don't want to hurt your feelings.
Yes.
Where if I say, like, I have nothing to do with it, they're more open to give you that. Agree, disagree?
Totally agree.
Okay.
And Google actually has a great book called Sprint. Google Ventures, a couple of the guys from Google Ventures put together this. It's based on other people's work, but the book is called Sprint, and they walk you through a process, and they mention that, and they have you set up an interview guide so that you're really, in advance, you're assigning the same tasks to people, you're recording the same data for every interview that you do, and you're taking your bias out of it.
Yeah.
Because not only are they going to be biased, but if you did the design, you're going to be biased because you want your design to work, obviously.
Sure.
And then I think there's another piece that's important, which is telling them that you're not testing them. This is about the software, this is about the product, and it's not about you, and you can't do anything wrong. And if there's a problem, it's not that you're dumb, it's that we're dumb because we designed it this way.
Right. I think that's actually really good advice, right? Because, how do you kind of bridge that with people? Like, what do you say to them when they first kind of come? As obviously, like, you reach out to them, they come, and sometimes you give them an incentive of, like, cash or a gift card or something. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But what do you kind of say to them when they first kind of come to the user testing session? And Google has the Sprint book has a whole methodology for this. Sure.
But you want to do a little bit of sort of, small talk, some basic questions, just who are you, what do you do? I mean, kind of the stuff you do at the beginning of any conversation, just because this may be someone you've never spoken to before, so you want some kind of rapport. And then you do the things, the things that we just said. You remove yourself. I wasn't involved in this product, which is usually pretty easy for me because I'm not. I'm usually coming in and helping out further along. And actually, in some of these I did 2 sessions yesterday, and in both sessions, I was like, I didn't do that. I inherited this. So I just, again, take myself out of it. And then I think you explicitly give people permission to experiment and not feel like they're being judged, and really make it about the product. And it's just amazing, like, really smart people, myself included, don't see what we think are obvious things, but they're clearly not obvious, or we would see them.
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting because I've even done like A/B testing in the past where something as simple as, I don't know, like a call to action button is one color, and then you try it a totally different color that in some ways I'm like, oh, that's awful, like design wise, right?
Right.
But that button color converts way better. So it's like, well, let's make it orange or whatever color converts more, right? Like at some point, I think as a designer, you kind of need to let your ego go a little bit and say, at the end of the day, it's what converts more, right? Do you really want to keep a button blue if the orange one converts better and you're doing a startup and you're not getting as many conversions? Like, you just need to almost iterate based on users' feedback. And I think as a designer myself, I think sometimes it's hard to do and kind of let go of something that you're so passionate about, right? And so if you can kind of remove yourself, because at the end of the day, you're not, well, you might not be the one actually using the product that you're building. I think we forget about that, at least from the design side.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And I think in both cases, you know, it's funny, I talked to a guy who was really good at online marketing.
Okay.
He was like, look, the stuff that converts is always the stuff that upsets the design team.
Totally. Yep.
Because it's not beautiful, but it's effective. Yep. And you know, every company ends up in this discussion. And I think it's exactly the same point as what we're talking about with the product. It's not just the color of the buttons, it is actually the design of the product. There is an intersection between what we want and what we think is great and what other human beings actually do. And the only thing that's going to work are the things in that intersection. Yeah. So I think the whole conversation we've been having today is about everyone's very good at thinking about what they want, but from the beginning of the process, before you even start building anything, start looking at that piece of what do other human beings actually do so that you get to that intersection more quickly and less expensively.
Oh, I think that's really good advice. And I think most people don't think about it like that, right? And I think the more and more as kind of designers and developers and people working on the product need to really think about that stuff, right? And really think about, and I think having user testing and doing user testing is, and try to do it as soon as possible, is almost like the most important thing you can do.
Right.
And you learn so much from that, and it's unbelievable.
Right, and I think, you know, again, I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs who are working on their MVP for the next 6 to 12 months and spending a lot of money to do it. And their answer to the customer thing is, I know people want to use this, and I'm going to turn on Facebook advertising and AdWords, and people are going to love it. And, you know, as someone who looks at a lot of business plans, I don't believe that anymore as a solution. You know, when I see that, I'm like, this person does not know their customer. They don't actually know what people are going to do. They haven't done the research, and it's going to be expensive and time-consuming once they start putting this in front of human beings.
Totally.
You know, I'd much rather see that people are already in front of customers and are already talking to people and already kind of understand the marketing, have already done some testing of the marketing, already have some people in there using it, because then I feel more comfortable that they know, you know, they're actually starting to see what people do and they're closer to that intersection.
Totally. Yeah, Mike, but sadly we're out of time. So maybe let's end the episode with kind of mentioning where people can learn more about you online, and if any other kind of social media stuff you want to mention.
Yeah, so I've got a website at mikelingle.com. It's MikeLingle.com, where I write the articles that you've been reading that we were talking about. I'm also a mentor at Venture Hive in Miami, and we are starting a fall accelerator program in the middle of September 19th. So, you know, if anyone's interested in that, I'm happy to talk about that. You can go to the website, venturehive.com. There's an application online. And, you know, all of my articles and all of the programs and all the mentoring that I do is really around this type of stuff. Like, how do you build the best possible business? And how do you start your company, and then how do you scale your company?
Sure. I love that. And you've been on the radio show a couple of times as well. And, you know, I'd love to have you again on kind of either show, to be honest with you. I think we could dive a lot deeper on tons of topics, to be honest with you.
I am happy to talk about this stuff all day long.
Love it. Love it. Well, thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show again.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
All right. Talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.